Daryl, afternoon, everybody. I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to 2020. This is an exciting year for those of us who enjoy these sorts of things. 2020 is obviously a presidential election year, which means this is the year where all the exciting stuff happens. Not necessarily the productive stuff, but lots of the exciting stuff happens. Along those lines, our first update of 2020 is going to be a little bit more political than usual as we talk kind of about the political process and what we expect to see. But we do expect to get some policy work done this year as well, and there should be some opportunities for us to get some good things done here in Washington. I will remind all of you that if you have questions, concerns, comments, or anything else about today's update, please feel free to put them in the little chat box on your screen. We'll circle back to those at the end of the presentation. And with that, talk about the Democratic primary process that will unfold in the next couple months. The Republicans will be renominating President Trump to be their nominee, so we won't dwell on those too much. But the primary process happens in essentially two acts. Act 1 will be February, where we have 4 well-established caucuses and primaries in small states that happen at sort of a leisurely pace for the primary calendar. February 3rd, so just a couple weeks from now, will be the Iowa caucus. Roughly a week later, New Hampshire primary. About a week and a half later is the Nevada caucus. And then exactly 1 week later is the South Carolina primary. These collectively will only result in about 155 delegates being awarded. The Democrats and the Republicans do it the same way. Give states at the tail end of the primary process more delegates to encourage states to hold their primary later. So the states that want to go first end up not getting very many delegates, but they do get a lot of attention because they're first. So that brings us to the end of February. And then we have Act 2, which starts just a few days after South Carolina. And on March 3rd, we have Super Tuesday, where we have 14 states holding primaries. And these include some of the big ones. Well, it includes California and Texas, the two biggest ones, but also Virginia, Massachusetts, Colorado, North Carolina. So some very substantial states, which are difficult. You know, it's one thing to run a campaign in Iowa, which is a relatively small state, not a lot of people there, inexpensive. It's a much different thing to say you have to run in California, Colorado, Maine, Massachusetts, North Carolina, Oklahoma all at the same time. And so the nature of the campaign will change swiftly, and those early primaries are followed by another batch a week later, another batch a week later, and then Georgia on March 24th. There are some additional primaries here in March for some of the territories. There's a primary for Americans who live outside the United States and thus have no place else to vote. There's a special primary for them. The result of all this is that by the end of March, about 2/3 of all the delegates for the nomination will have been awarded. That is, about 2/3 of all the delegates that will be awarded will have been awarded. Roughly 2,600 between all of the states. You need about, we think, and this is less clear than you would think these things would be, but about 1,990 delegates to win the nomination. So there will be more than enough for somebody to lock this up and have the nomination by then, although it's not terribly likely. And so just to give you kind of a big picture of what's going on here, the primary process is actually a private process, technically. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party are private entities. So they can, negotiate their nomination process pretty much any way they want within some very broad bounds set by the law. Both parties have settled on this kind of model for choosing their nominee. And it's an interesting one because we have 4 primaries scheduled well in advance at well-known states, all of which are very small, which give unknown candidates, underfunded candidates, smaller candidates an opportunity to get their feet on the ground, to get known, to get seen, to build up a movement, to build up a volunteer base, to get themselves organized. But then we switch very quickly to kind of hardcore campaigning where these candidates are going to have to run national campaigns with national teams of professionals and armies of volunteers and large amounts of money relatively quickly. And when we shift from Act 1 to Act 2 here, a lot of the second-tier candidates will get run over pretty quickly. You know, coming out of South Carolina, if Senator Klobuchar, Mayor Pete, maybe even Elizabeth Warren don't do well in those first 4 primaries, there simply isn't going to be time for them to recover and still run a credible campaign. What's interesting this year is Mayor Bloomberg, former mayor of New York City, entered the race very late, and he's actually not contesting the first 4 primaries. He's just sitting them out entirely. But he is investing heavily in the March primaries. And rumor has it he's already hired over 3,000 campaign staff. He has staff in all the second tier, the Act 2 states. He's running national television campaigns. He was all over football last weekend. Rumor has it he's going to buy an ad for the Super Bowl. So he kind of skipped the retail politics phase of the election and has skipped right to the national campaign. Don't know how that's going to work for him, but it's an interesting little wrinkle. And we should have a fairly good idea of, if not who the nominee is, at least the top 2, probably all that are going to be able to survive March. Quick little update on impeachment. IEEE-USA is, of course, not involved in this. This is not our fight. Last couple of months, I've been giving you the impeachment odds, which are now at 100%, given that President Trump has been impeached by the House. Just yesterday, the House formally passed the impeachment, the articles of impeachment, to the Senate. The Senate is now in the process of organizing its own process for the impeachment trial. However, the Las Vegas odds on the president leaving office early are currently sitting at about 9%, and that isn't necessarily just impeachment. That could also be, you know, death or resignation. And I think that's about right. Not too many people think there's a particularly good chance the Senate will vote to convict and remove the president. But we are going to go through the motion of having a trial. It's required, so we're going to do that. What's interesting is the thinking on Capitol Hill is the Senate trial will last until around the first couple days of February. It's going to take a little while to get organized, and then there's a process they got to go through. The issue there is that 3 of the Democratic frontrunners for the Democratic presidential nomination, Warren, Sanders, and Klobuchar, knew I was missing someone, are all senators, and so they're going to have to be in Washington for the impeachment hearings, probably have to be here for those, which will cut into their Iowa time. So on to our schedule of political events for the year, just kind of highlight the big ones. February 4th is scheduled to be the State of the Union address, also right around when the impeachment trial should end, so that should be fun. July 13th through 16th, the Democrats will have their convention in Milwaukee, and I think you will agree there are far fewer, more fun things to watch on television than political conventions. We'll have a brief interlude from politics from July 24th to the 9th for the Summer Olympics. The Republicans have their convention in Charlotte, August 24th through the 27th. And then Election Day is the 3rd, November 3rd. It's worth noting, I think, there's a little bit bigger gap between the conventions than we usually have. The Democrats are a little bit earlier than usual. Republicans are a little later than usual. Don't think you can read too much into that. It just sort of is, and I don't know if it's meaningful, but it's worth noting. All right, on to policy and kind of the more important stuff. Much to my surprise, Congress actually passed a budget. They got the 2020 fiscal year budget done on December 20th, which was kind of the last possible day for them to do it. And it was mostly good news for us. most of the budgets that IEEE members care about did reasonably well. Just some highlights: Department of Energy, ARPA-E saw a 16% increase, which is fantastic. ARPA-E is Department of Energy's research department, kind of speculative basic research department. Nuclear energy research went up 12.6%. NASA saw a 5% increase in its budget, but exploration technology budget went up nearly 20%, which is great. The aeronautics budget, which is often overlooked in NASA, went up 8%. NIST saw a 5% increase, which is on top of a healthy increase the year before. IEEE-USA prioritized NIST. It kind of, like aeronautics, gets forgotten sometimes. And so we were very pleased to see nearly a 5% increase. Some other budgets they did fine, but they didn't quite as well. DoD, overall, their research budget kind of treaded water. They ended up at a plus 3%, which is a little better than inflation. National Science Foundation, 2.5% increase, which is basically the rate of inflation. A little better, but not much. Oddly, DARPA in the Department of Defense saw its budget only increase 0.9%, which was a bit of a surprise. Department of Homeland Security's research budget was actually cut 10%. That was the result of a policy decision. The idea is that the Department of Homeland Security isn't really a research organization, and if Homeland Security needs research done, they should contact another part of the government that actually does research and have them do the work for them. Congress decided they didn't really want Department of Homeland Security building a brand new research infrastructure on top of the research infrastructures that all the other agencies have. So that it's a 10% cut, but it's not based on it's not because Congress didn't think the research was valid, it's because they thought it should be done someplace else. The fiscal year 2021 budget really hasn't gotten underway yet. The president's budget, which kicks off the fiscal year, kind of the fiscal budget season, is due in early February. It'll probably be a little bit late. It usually is. We don't know what it's going to say, but we kind of do. The president's budgets the past 3 years have been fairly consistent. Broad cuts to pretty much everything that's not defense. We expect that again this year, and we expect the press will write a bunch of stories about how the sky is falling. Congress will huff and puff for a little while, and then everybody will forget about the president's budget, and Congress will do whatever it wants, which is also what has happened the last 3 years. And we will then work with Congress on their budget efforts, which will begin in February, get going really in March. We do not expect the fiscal 21 budget to be done before the election. Congress does not want to do hardcore budget work in September because they'll be running for re-election. And so we expect them to punt until after the election, but they probably will get the budget done in November, December, assuming none of the chambers switch parties, which is the betting line in Washington for the election, that the Democrats will continue to hold the House, the Republicans will continue to hold the Senate. Presidents, we don't know who the Democratic nominee is, so I don't know what the odds are on that one. But this is kind of what we expect. There is an interesting argument floating around that impeachment will help get the fiscal 21 budget off to a good start. And the thinking is this. For the next 2 or 3 weeks, the Senate will be discussing whether or not to remove the president from office, which means the House has nothing to do. I mean, the House has already done its part in impeachment, and there'll be speeches and press releases to put out, but there's no actual work, which means House members are free to have quiet conversations amongst themselves about what they want to do on the budget. It's also important that the public is going to want Congress to prove it can get stuff done once the impeachment process is over, regardless of what the results are. The House could get off on the right foot by producing budget documents relatively quickly to prove to the public that it can still accomplish things. As you know, because of the Constitution, the House has to go first before the Senate can act on any budget bill. And so giving them a quiet couple weeks to start the process could actually help things move along more smoothly. We'll see if that happens, but it's not an unreasonable expectation. A little bit of update on immigration policy. The Fairness Act, that's the country cap bill, is actually slated to move later this month. Senator Durbin struck a deal with Senator Lee to get some H-1B reforms into the bill, good reforms, actually. However, there are at least 2 Republicans that say they still oppose the bill and will block it. There may be other Democrats that will block it as well, I don't know. But the plan is still to move this on unanimous consent, and so if even one senator says no, then it's not moving anywhere. But there is a better odds of this bill becoming law this year than there were a month ago or even 2 months ago. So we shall see. Update on AB5. AB5 is the gig economy bill that California passed last September. Among the problems with the bill is the bill may prohibit most IT consulting in California. Even if it doesn't actually prohibit it, the law is so vague that companies are behaving as though IT consulting has been prohibited. Opposition to AB5 is increasing across the California economy. Truckers, writers, reporters, freelancers of all sorts are suddenly realizing how much this bill will impact them. The champions, the author of the bill and the champions of the bill seem to be digging in their heels. They're responding to the increased criticisms with becoming very defensive, which does not suggest that they're going to be interested in compromising to reform the bill. IEEE has learned that several IEEE members have lost contracts. These are IEEE members who are consultants of one sort or another, and they have been told by their clients that they can no longer be consultants. We've had a couple offer where the IEEE member has been offered full-time employment or part-time employment, but they can no longer be consultants. So there's ways around the bill. It's just that IEEE members who chose to become consultants did so for a reason. And the alternatives to being a consultant, being a full-time employee or even a part-time employee, have complications. And there's a reason our folks didn't want to do that. And there are problems with the law now requiring them to go to a different working status. IEEE members out in California, including IEEE past president Tom Coughlin, who is an IT consultant in Silicon Valley. They've met with state legislators several times. They have additional meetings this week and next. They are delivering the message loud and clear that this bill has potential to do serious harm to the technology professional community of California, and that's a fairly important community out there. I can also tell you that a number of other states are salivating over the chance of poaching some of the consultants in California, because if you leave California, you're no longer, you no longer have to abide by the law, and so you can still be a consultant. There is a lot of pressure on California to change the bill, and so I suspect some reforms are coming. Whether they will cover IT workers or not, I don't know yet, but we are pushing hard to make sure that they do. I mentioned this a couple months ago. Senator Schumer from New York, Democrat from New York, has proposed a $100 billion, program for new science research, and science and engineering, engineering would be included in that. He's calling this a moonshot. Of course, people call everything a moonshot these days, but includes all the major technologies. And we've now learned that this would be all new money. So he's not talking about taking money from other programs. He's proposing $100 billion in new government spending on just research and technology. And that's a lot of money. $100 billion is a lot, even by Washington terms. We've had meetings with the senator to discuss this. We actually have another meeting with him at 2 o'clock today, so just after this call is ended, to find out what his plans are and what the details are. This is probably just a campaign thing. It's an attempt to get a talking point for the Democrats for the fall campaign, but it would be too cynical to say that's all that this is. Senator Schumer does have a legitimate, an honest interest in increasing spending for science and engineering. So even if this bill doesn't pass this year, the attention that it brings to our concerns and our industries and the support that it generates will be helpful in next Congress. I remain skeptical that we'll get $100 billion in new money, but frankly, even $50 billion would be a lot of money. And so while this bill, I'm not yet sold that this is a real legislative proposal, that doesn't mean it's totally meaningless. IEEE-USA will be working with Senator Schumer to help craft the bill. We will we don't know what it actually, haven't seen it on paper yet, but we will probably support it, and we will let you know what it says and where it is in the process as it moves along. Digital privacy. Excuse me. Just before Christmas, the House Energy and Commerce Committee released a draft digital privacy bill that has been endorsed by a respectable number of the important players on this issue in the House. In the Senate, Senator Maria Cantwell from Washington has introduced her Consumer Online Privacy Rights Act, the COPRA Act, and the Senate Democrats seem to be coalescing around this bill. Now, what's happened for the past year on digital privacy, as we've talked about, is there's been a lot of proposals, a lot of legislation introduced, but most of them were just one-person bills. A lot of legislators introduced their own ideas, which is great, but they were talking point bills, they were messaging bills, they weren't actual attempts to legislate. These two bills appear to be serious bills. Now, it's not that the particular provisions in them matter at this point. It's more that the conversation in both the House and the Senate over what Congress is going to do on digital privacy seems to be coalescing around these two bills. And that conversations are at least sort of bipartisan. So Maria Cantwell is a Democrat. So right now all the co-sponsors on our bill are Democrats, but a number of Republicans are making noises as though they see Cantwell's bill as a real bill that they expect to be part of the process of developing. So it's probably too late in the legislative year. It's obviously not too late in the year, but it's too late to get a major bill like this through Congress in 2020. It really needed to be developed, and the debate started in 2019. Keeping in mind that Congress is going to more or less stop working sometime over the summer as they try to get reelected. But 2021 is a very good year to get bills like this passed after a presidential election, 2 years before the next election. So the debate this year, we expect to frame the debate next year. IEEE-USA is right in the middle of this conversation. We worked with Senator Cantwell on her bill. We have very good relations with that office. We're working with the House guys on their bill. So as Congress's thinking develops and matures, we expect to be right there at the table. Just a little update on what's going on in energy. Kind of similar to where we were on digital privacy last year. We're currently monitoring about 40 energy bills in Congress. Most of these are fairly small bills. Most of them deal on energy production, particularly alternative energy. Not to say they're bad bills, but they're relatively targeted and small. Most aren't bipartisan, but a couple are. At some point, like what we're seeing with digital privacy, Congress is going to start to, use metaphor here to the creation of planets. You start with a field of dust, and a couple pieces of dust are a little bigger than the others, and so things start to clump. Legislation works kind of similarly. And eventually, in roughly the same time span, you end up with a piece of legislation. So we expect some of these bills to start gaining some momentum and other provisions attached to it. We are talking with all the key legislators to kind of get a sense of which of these bills are going to emerge as relevant. But right now, it's not clear which bills are going to emerge nor when that's going to happen. So we're watching, and again, this is kind of a 2021 play, probably. Lastly, we want to highlight actual success in Congress, which is exciting. The Pallone-Thune Trace Act passed the Senate on December 19th and was in fact signed into law by President Trump on December 30th. This is a bill attacking robocalls. Among its provisions is it empowers the FCC to attack illegal spammers, illegal robocallers, by giving the FCC greater enforcement powers, creating stiffer penalties, lengthening the statute of limitations on violations of the law. So basically, they've taken the gloves at least partly off and allowed the FCC to start attacking this problem aggressively, which is good. The bill calls on carriers to develop anti-spoofing technologies, which is exciting. It gives consumers the right to block robocalls and has told carriers that they have to figure out a way to do that and can't charge consumers for the privilege. And it's given the FCC the right to block and to attack overseas phone scams. It also has a big section in there on special protections for hospitals, all of which is fantastic, all of which is useful. This is not everything that IEEE-USA wanted, but it is a good step in the right direction. I'll remind folks that, if you look at the bill, this is S-151, that if the bill doesn't have everything you wanted, keep in mind that this represents a fairly major shift in U.S. policy towards phone calls. U.S. policy towards phone calls since the very beginning has been it is the government's job to make sure calls go through, and connectivity was the focal point. It was the measurement of success. Now we have the U.S. government taking the position that some calls should not go through, and the U.S. government is now, the FCC specifically, has been empowered to actually block some calls. That's a big shift in culture. More work needs to be done here, but this still represents real progress and a real accomplishment, and we talk about how Congress can't get stuff done. We need to recognize when they do. This was a bipartisan bill, bicameral bill. It took a little longer to pass than we hoped, but Congress got it done, and it is now the law of the land, and that is a good thing. IEEE-USA's 2020 CVD, we are currently accepting registrations. We have about 30 people registered already, and we just opened the registration just a couple days ago. It is March 24th and 25th here in Washington, D.C. We have secured 2 of the best rooms within the Capitol Hill complex for our training session and our reception. The training session will start at noon, well, 12:30 on the 24th. So those of you who are not on the West Coast should be able to come in that morning. The 24th, the training, we will teach you everything you need to know about meeting with legislators, about policies that we're going to be talking about, how to get around on Capitol Hill. You will be teamed with IEEE colleagues from around the country, many of whom have been doing this for years, and so they really know what they're doing. We encourage every single IEEE member within the United States to come to this event if you are interested. That includes students, it includes retirees, it includes folks who are not yet American citizens. If you're interested in this sort of thing, please join us on March 24th and 25th. The registration page is there on the screen, IEEE.org/advocacy/CVD for Congressional Visits Day. So I look forward to seeing you all in March. Our next update will be February 20th, 1 o'clock Eastern as usual. We'll have a look at the President's budget by then. The impeachment thing should be behind us one way or another. And so we should have lots and lots of exciting things to talk about. We should also have a clearer picture of the Democratic primary process and should have a better picture of kind of legislative priorities for 2020 by then. And with that, Daryl, do we have any questions?
There are no questions.
Okay. I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. My email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. My direct phone number is 202-530-8326. I want to thank you all for joining us. Please feel free to reach out if any questions come to you in the next days or weeks. And until then, thank you for joining me this afternoon, and I'll see you all in February. Thanks.